Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries RPG podcast with John and Hannah.
Hi.
And today we're going to be venturing deep into the swamps to look at the Bullywug. Okay, so we recently did a one-day poll on Twitter where we asked our listeners to choose from a choice of 3 monsters from the classic Fiend folio for AD&D, and the one that was chosen was the Bullywug. Now, Bullywugs first appeared in the Fiend folio, not surprisingly, and they've existed in some form or other in most D&D versions over the years. The Fiend folio describes them as a Backtrachian, which is apparently a tailless amphibian race of frogmen who inhabit wet and marshy places of the world. Their intelligence level ranges from primitive to human levels, with the different tribes of Bullywugs having a great hatred of each other. According to the Fiend folio, Bullywugs have a fast swim speed when unencumbered and can also hop forwards or backwards, gaining a +1 to hit rolls when doing so. If they use an impaling weapon while they're doing this, they deliver double damage. They're also well camouflaged in their preferred choice of surroundings and have a 75% chance to be overlooked if motionless. And they're encountered in pretty large numbers, 10 to 80 according to the original Fiend folio, so a significant rumble if you run into a load of Bullywugs, although individually they've only got a single hit dice. Another interesting wrinkle is that unless they're using long weapons, they attack last in the turn automatically because they're sort of uncoordinated when they're like hopping about and everything. Okay, so why don't we have a look at the monster manual for 2nd ed D&D and see what it says about them in that.
Your combat's pretty much the same.
Yeah.
Although I don't see that rule about them being slightly more unwieldy. There's a bit more about their society in this one, which specifically identifies them as fascist.
All right, okay.
It was the 80s, let's not go into that. It describes their society of them having like one big leader who's the boss, who's probably killed the last leader to get that job.
Okay.
And then there's a short bit about like a more advanced version of their society where they live in like domed buildings and they might have a second level shaman present.
Sorry, I was going to say one thing I do see that's interesting there, just looking over the habit and society bit, it says, on an individual level, Bullywugs lack the greed and power lust seen in the individuals of other chaotic races, like orcs for instance. It says fighting members of the same group is almost non-existent. Some people say that's because of their lack of intelligence rather than like lack of spite, but that's quite interesting because as we'll see as we go later on, they gradually seem to be cast more and more sort of evilly as they go on, whereas the AD&D 2nd ed monster manual seems to be saying like, oh, between like a tribe or a group there isn't actually a lot of fighting.
This one seemed to me to be like the most animalistic version of them.
Okay.
Whereas like other ones sort of almost have slightly different models. These seem to be most like a group of animals, sort of almost like they've been modelled on a tribe of gorillas with the one silverback. That's sort of an idea, but they're frogmen.
One other thing I'd like to say is I love the artwork again in the AD&D 2nd ed monster manual. I mean, it just looks a bit like someone's pushed Kermit one step too far to me. And it's this sort of light green skinned frogman with some sort of like shellac or sort of shell armour on, a metal shield, a little short sword, big red tongue hanging out, massive bulging eyes, sort of like lunging forward as though he's like lifting up his sword ready to attack, with that slightly cartoony sort of style you tend to get in the AD&D 2nd ed monster manual. But I think that looks really great for that particular enemy. Okay, so that's it for the AD&D 2nd ed monster manual, but as we've said, it's appeared in almost every edition. Now, in D&D 3.5, they didn't make an appearance until the publication of the monstrous compendium, Monsters of Faerun. Now, in keeping with this version of D&D's focus on skills, the Bullywug's camouflage ability, like we said previously, 75% chance to remain invisible. They just get like a big +6 bonus to hide in marshes. They also get no movement penalties in such terrain. Now, according to this book, This version of the Bullywug has clerics that are notorious for having powerful but unpredictable summoning abilities. Whenever a Bullywug cleric casts a summon monster spell, there's a 50% chance more than one more monster of that type will appear, but there's also a 25% chance that none of the monsters will be controlled and they just attack randomly when they appear, which is, I think, quite interesting, and could lead to a lot of chaotic sort of scenarios. I think that's just a bit of good fun. Now, in order to fit them into the Forgotten Realms background, the Bullywugs are described as having fought a war against the Civs, which is a race in the same book, and it's also a race of frogmen who are trained as monks and they sort of live in the same terrain. The Bullywugs apparently lost this war, but the Civs allowed them to exist as a buffer zone between themselves and the outside world. Now, I've got to say, much as I found some interesting stuff in this, I think the artwork's quite disappointing in this one. They've obviously trying to show a Bullywug sort of lunging out of the water, its tongue lashing out, but it just doesn't grab me.
The thing that struck me the most about this when we were reading through all of them was there's a particular sentence that keeps appearing from here on, and I think this is the first time it's there, which is, "Life as a Bullywug is nasty, brutish and wet."
Well, there you go. If ever there was a tagline for a show, I think that's it.
And this version of their society is sort of, I don't know, less animalistic than the previous one, but certainly not sort of a fully formed society as yet, as it becomes in later editions.
Yeah.
Again, you've still got your big boss Bullywug that's in charge, and this is the one that doesn't specifically mention them having the big boss Bullywug that's in charge. It just specifically mentions that the biggest Bullywug in the pond is frequently a second level barbarian.
Yeah, I was going to say, to reference what you were saying earlier about the civilization changing of the Bullywugs, I've noticed that from this point, it's, like you say, it ceases to become, the savage sort of non-humans who live in swamps and whatever, and they're very tribal, and it almost becomes a sort of evil aping of sort of the standard human pseudo sort of medieval society you get in there, and that becomes more and more pronounced from this point on as we go through the edition. So we've got here, they've started to get the clerics coming in, they've started to describe their society as this bullying sort of clambering over each other to sort of get to the top society. So I don't know whether that started because in this book certainly they were trying to fold it into the Forgotten Realms setting or not. But a lot of the stuff in here seems to have been carried forward to future editions. Okay, so why don't we have a look at 4th edition now? Now, Bullywugs didn't appear in 4th edition until the 2nd monster manual they did. Now, as was the way with 4th edition, the Bullywug gets a number of different stat blocks from the basic Mucker, a low-level brutish warrior, up to the Mudlord, a much more impressive foe with more hit points, who can shoot lightning and sacrifice his own followers to improve his power. Now, one of the things I really loved in this is it says, Bullywugs are portrayed as having an innate hatred for the wrongness of their own existence, a hatred that they sort of turn outwards. And it describes that the reason they sort of preemptively attack other races is because they assume, rightly or wrongly, that those other races will eventually, because they are so wrong, get round to attacking them. So they're like, we want to stick the knife in first, basically. And this carried over into the mechanics, where if you're a player character and you get a crit against a Bullywug, they have a thing called Nature's Release, where the player who's just critted them actually gains a variable number of hit points back based on the type of Bullywug they've just laid the smackdown on. Now,
damn, 4th ed was weird.
Yeah, and it's not really fair to directly compare the 4th ed mechanics to other editions, because there were so many differences. Most creatures in 4th edition had various powers and abilities, something which, actually, oddly in this case, I think this feels more like the original Fiend Folio version of the Bullywug than the 3.5 version. Because in 3.5, a lot of their abilities just got folded into, they've got some extra skill points, and that's pretty much it. Whereas the sort of Fiend Folio one was quite quirky. You had the hopping attack, you had stuff like that, you had the camouflage. And the sort of the powers model of 4th edition feels a little bit more like the Fiend Folio version, albeit the mechanics are different. But having those sort of weird, quirky powers really seems to harken back to the original Bullywug, in my opinion. Now, one thing I did like in 4th edition is that each monster entry got some lore, and the Bullywugs are no exception. They believe they were created by the original primordials, not the gods. And apparently, if they please their creators through acts of wanton cruelty, one day they will be reborn as Slard, who are extraplanar creatures of chaos who share a frog-like appearance. I'm not aware of any sort of previous link between these two races, so maybe they were planning to do it as something further in, like 4th Ed later down the line, or maybe it's just a rumour or a mistaken belief. I don't know, but I just thought that was an interesting thing. So you don't have to make anything of it, but if you wanted to lead on to like extraplanar threats and stuff like that later on, there's like a ready-made link there for you to pull on if you wanted to. And I quite like the art in it as well.
That also explains the weird self-hating fascist thing that they've got going on, because they think they're wrong because they're not the perfect Slard.
Well, that's it, exactly. In the sort of cosmology of 4th edition, they had this whole sort of primordial / god war, which was, again, one of the things I liked about 4th Ed, because that's very sort of classic mythology, in my view. You know, like the sort of primordials were like really powerful and like, but fought chaotic sort of divinities that came before the gods, but didn't care about mortals or the world. They were just like doing their own thing and like causing vast harm. They were very chaotic, and then the gods were like, no, we'll have less of this, and they warred on them and like imprisoned them. So I love that because I'm a big fan of classic mythology, but like I say, I like the idea they've used that as a justification as to why the Bullywugs are so sort of like uber violent towards like other races, because they're like, oh, eventually they'll realise that the primordials made us and they'll start attacking us. Let's just like put the boot in before they can do that and get rid of them. Then it's not really a thing. Which obviously, if you've got any sense, that's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you attack someone, yeah, they're probably going to attack you back. But then again, we're not all xenophobic frogmen, are we? So now, after this, in 5th edition, Bullywugs appear to be back to their previous low-level swamp threats. Although, according to the 5th edition Monster Manual, they now consider themselves the right and proper rulers of their swamp-like territory. Although, how this jibes with like the previous sort of link with the Civs in Forgotten Realms of previous editions, assuming they're going to stick with that at all, I've obviously got no idea. The leaders are still referred to as Mucklords, and they preside over a cruelly whimsical form of etiquette that they enforce on their tribe.
Yeah, this version of it's quite cartoony. They're almost Disney villain.
Yeah, very much.
Their underlings will capture you, bring you back to the Mucklord, and then the Mucklord will show you how marvellous the swamp is and all these amazing riches that he's accumulated.
Probably wearing some robes.
And then you'll probably be able to trick or bribe your way out if you can't fight your way out.
Exactly, like you say, they've become a little bit cartoony. Like I say, there's this they're described as a foul aristocracy in the 5th edition Monster Manual. Although they do get some interesting new abilities. They can now speak to frogs and toads. They get stealth bonuses as previous. They also gain advantage on Dex stealth checks when they're in the swamps to represent their camouflage. They can always make hide checks in swampy terrain, and they still get the ability to jump large distances from a standing start, although this in itself doesn't give them any attack bonuses, as with the earlier editions. They've still got a tendency to attack using spears and long weapons, but they now also get a bite attack, which seems a bit weird to me, because I don't know for sure, but I've never really imagined like frogs having like massive teeth.
I believe they've got fairly powerful jaws for animals of their size.
All right, okay, well there you go. You learn something new every day.
I think it depends on the frog.
Now, again, I've got to say, I'm not keen on the artwork in the 5th edition version. There's nothing particularly wrong with it. It just shows like a frogman with a spear, but like it's got a bit of that like Watership Down, is it? Not Watership Down, Mole and Ratty. Wind of the Willows.
Yeah, it's got a bit of the Wind in the Willows flavour to it.
Yeah, it's like it doesn't look scary 3D. At all. Yeah, it looks like it's been touched up on a computer.
In fact, what it looks most like to me, certainly the face of it, is those weird ornaments of frogs that like weird old aunties had in the 70s.
I've just thought, you know what it reminds me of? So to anyone who remembers like the Crazy Frog, that's what the art puts me in mind of, which potentially isn't a very good thing. Like I say, there's nothing particularly wrong with it. I mean, but it looks cartoony in a way that doesn't have the sort of like quirky humour of the original. To me, it looks like it's been over photoshopped.
Yeah, it's like super 3D shading on it.
Yeah. Now, however, this was not the only appearance of the Bullywugs in 5th edition thus far. They also appeared in the Ghosts of Saltmarsh, which is Wizards of the Coast's reimagining of the classic Saltmarsh series of adventures. Those being The Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh, published in 1981, Danger at Dunwater in 1982, and The Final Enemy in 1983.
Oh yes, this is the Frog Chorus version.
That's it, exactly. And we get some stats for variant Bullywugs. The Croaker, which, as you were saying, is the sort of like the pompous form of their race, and they've got the ability to do these magical croaking songs. I think there's 2 types. One causes psychic damage, and the other like heals their allies. We also get the stats for the Bullywug Royal, which is presumably the Mucklord of previous iterations. A larger and more intelligent specimen who apes human nobility, occasionally rides giant toads, and once a day can issue a croaking decree that gives their Bullywug subjects advantage on their attacks for the next turn.
Mm-hmm.
So you get a few little variants in there, which is nice because obviously the Ghost of Saltmarsh has like an aquatic theme to it, so there's like Sagwin and various lizard type races and the Kraken and stuff like that. So it's nice to see the Bullywug sort of making a bit of a reappearance in that. And if you're going to use them in your campaign, it's always nice to have a couple of variant stat blocks, really, isn't it?
It is. Saves you having to worry about balancing them yourself.
Exactly, yeah.
So, how many times have you used them in a game?
I've used them a couple of times in a game, although I've never actually referred to them as Bullywugs. I normally just refer to them as like frogmen or stuff like that. And I tend to use them sort of interchangeably with like lizardmen, because they're the similar terrain, swampy, marshy sort of terrain. And the way I've tended to use them is I've tended to have like lizardmen are sort of more sort of deep swamp, like a bayou style stuff like where alligators would be. Whereas I've tended to, I don't know if this is right or not, I'm no expert on like frogs, but I've tended to use frogmen in the slightly sort of marshier but sort of slightly cooler sort of areas. And I won't say I've extensively used like Bullywug stats, to be honest, because 99% of the time I've just like reskinned lizardmen and described them as frogs, just to give like a bit of a contrast rather than just like lizardmen in swamps all the time. But I do think they're an interesting race, and they've obviously got something to them, because unlike some races we've looked at in the Fiend Folio where they've fallen by the wayside and we've really had to struggle to find some information about them. I mean, we've got like 5 or 6 books here, and that's with me just having like a quick search on the internet and then a quick flick through the books I've got in my possession. So they've obviously got something to them that means they've sort of survived this long. Now, I don't know whether that's purely because, maybe they're one of the sort of few types of monsters that are supposed to exist in that particular terrain, along with lizard men, so that's why they sort of get toted out every time. They're like, oh, we need to do a swamp book, or we need to do an aquatic supplement. All right, what races have we got? I best bring the Bullywugs out again. But it's, as we were saying earlier, it's been interesting to see how they've slowly evolved from basically like these animalistic sort of tribal people into this weird sort of swamp nobility with the Mucklords like swanning about in their robes, riding on their giant frogs, and almost like a sort of Alice in Wonderland sort of vibe.
Sort of vaguely reminiscent of, is it Dickens that had beggar kings?
I think so, yeah.
Those sorts of characters.
I was going to say, so how about we talk about how you could use them in your campaign? Now, I've got a few notes that I've sort of made as we've been reading through it, and I think the most obvious way of using them is that they're basically like your consummate bad guys. Now, don't get me wrong, you can have bad guys with very developed sort of backstories and moral ambiguity and stuff like that, but occasionally in a D&D game, you just want some bad guys. You can go in, smash the doors of their dungeon down, steal the gold, kill the bad guys, and get out.
And they made a very satisfying thump when they hit the ground.
Exactly, and certainly in the earlier days, the earlier versions of D&D, Bullywugs didn't really have any like redeeming features or great depth to them. They were just shallow, sort of like swamp men who dwelt in these marshes, generally attacking other races around them and having a very sort of roughly sketched in sort of stereotypical tribal society. they can occupy a similar niche in games to like kobolds or other low-level monsters, because they're not a particularly hard foe to come against, so low-level players can come up against them. So if you're running a game set, a swampy environment, or maybe you've got a flooded dungeon or something, and you're like, I want something different from the standard kobolds, you can slide bullywugs in there, and it's not going to be any real sort of like additional threat or problem. But also, as we've said, as you go on, I find one of the most interesting things about them is they can act as like a dark mirror to the sort of standard pseudo-medieval society you get in D&D. Because I'm not saying this is for every campaign, but the sort of standard pseudo-fantasy setting for D&D assumes, you've got knights, you've got lords, you've got peasants, you've got stuff like that. And the way that the Bullywugs sort of reflect this, when they're sort of like, they're almost like aping this society. You've got like the Mucklords there who issue their random pronunciations and their sort of decrees, and their followers have to go along with it. And they're quite willing to like sacrifice and damage their own people as long as it furthers their own aims. So I think if you want, I'm not saying you have to, I mean, they can just be used as monsters, as we were saying, but if you wanted to use them as like almost like a living critique or a caricature of the rest of the society in a standard D&D game, you could quite easily do that. Because how many times have you seen a story in a D&D game where there's some like nasty noble you've got to get rid of, and they're viewed as nasty because like, they don't care about the people who are working on the land for them, they just want to improve their prestige and their wealth or whatever. And obviously normally the player characters are trying to overthrow them. I mean, even look back at like classic storytelling, you've got the Sheriff of Nottingham in like Robin Hood and people like that. If you didn't want to sort of do it as near to the nose with like human antagonists, or maybe you want to get the players to think about like, is our own society actually any good? You could easily show them the Bullywugs with this sort of like weird, like horrible, like swamp nobility, and perhaps the players would think, are we any better than them really? So I think that could be interesting, depending on how you wanted to get into it. Also, there's the ties to the Slard, as we've said, which if you wanted to link into like extra-planar sort of chaotic adventures later on, you've got a ready-made link there that you can use. If you don't, you can just ignore that. It's just a rumour or one of their mistaken beliefs. Absolutely fine. But even if you don't want it to be true, you could easily run an adventure or an interesting thing where you're talking about why they think that's the case.
But earlier on, you mentioned the fact that lizardmen and bullywugs tend to occupy similar territory.
Yeah.
An interesting idea might be to have some sort of civil war going on between the two of them.
Yeah.
And there's a lot you could do with that, because you don't necessarily want either side to win. It might be beneficial for you to keep pushing that war.
Oh yeah,
depending on the player group and where they're coming from.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly some of the best sort of old school style modules for me, whether it's a dungeon, a wilderness crawl, whatever, are those where you have a number of different factions with like competing goals. So if you wanted to run like a dungeon or whatever in that vein set in a swamp, you could quite easily have like a faction of bullywugs and a faction of lizardmen, as you say there, maybe with overlapping territory, perhaps like the dungeon's in the middle of it, like you say, a bit of a civil war going on between them, and that could add just like a nice whole like additional layer to whatever adventure you're running the player characters through.
And because their society is fairly simplistic, and they do sort of fit a lot of simple stereotypes for standard roleplay villain, it allows you to have a bit more time to do other stuff and create these like lots of factions with lots of things.
Yeah.
You don't need to devote that much time to thinking what are the bullywugs going to do. They're going to summon a random monster and kill anyone that goes in their swamp.
Yeah, pretty much. Although it did say in one of the books, I forget which one, one of the ones where it's talking about the Mucklords and the sort of like strange contradictory sort of edicts they hand down to their followers, is that they also have like a very sort of clear sort of almost sort of diplomatic sort of sense when dealing with other races, but it varies so wildly between like the different tribes, because it's basically whatever the Mucklords said it is. So you could also potentially have them as maybe like allies of convenience. If they've maybe got a Mucklord who's like actually, I could make use of these like player characters. Oh yeah, I've decreed today that like we're not going to kill any outsiders on site. Make sure all the rest of the tribe hear it. And then of course there'll probably be the inevitable betrayal at the end, or the players will find out that the Bullywugs are like behind something, or they have like an evil plan. But it could certainly be an interesting adventure if you had to ally with a tribe of initially not so hostile Bullywugs against a greater foe. Like maybe you're stuck in the swamps and like your normal allies and races you'd normal ally with aren't anywhere to be found. And if this like Bullywug Mucklord and his like swamp court approach you and they're like, oh actually yeah, we want to deal with those lizard men as well. I tell you what, if you agree to this, that and the other, we'll help you out and we'll send some of our warriors with you. The players might not have any choice. So that could certainly be interesting. Like I say, allies of convenience. Another thing I quite liked, and I think is a potentially good use of them, as I mentioned earlier, I quite like the whole sort of primordial god sort of war vibe. Very much as echoes of classic mythology to me. The Bullywugs, as creatures who believe they were made by the primordials, they must have actually existed for like ages, because the primordials were before the gods. Mm-hmm. So potentially they're an older race than like even the other old races like elves and whatnot. So depending on how deeply you want to get into that and their sort of background, if they even know it, you could use that to reveal some like far-flung past sort of lore about your campaign world. So that's quite interesting, and as we said, they've also got potential ties to the Slod if you want to have those. And I think my final thought about what you could use them for in your game is for drawing the players into different types of terrain. Now we know that swamps and marshes, they're very interesting types of terrain because they've got characteristics of like solid ground and also of deep water, but they're like somewhere in the middle. They're like a halfway house.
I found out the other day that the word for that is a liminal space.
Oh,
a between place.
There
liminal spaces.
So in addition to being one of these liminal spaces, they've also got their own challenges, and there's also different varieties of swamps, like bayous, marshes, stuff like that. Off bogs, often with rich and wildly different ecosystems, and that's just in the real world. Never mind when you like plump all the fantasy stuff on top. So I think you could certainly use the threat of like Bullywugs to draw player characters into that if you maybe wanted to get them into an interesting different type of terrain. And I'm going to do a gratuitous plug now to say that if you want to know a bit more about that type of terrain, you might want to check out the cinematic Environs Wetlands by Critical Hit Publishing. There'll be a link to that in the description of this show. Although it's technically for 5th edition, it's not a difficult conversion to be honest, and the advice offered in this range of books about different types of terrain is quite useful. I've got a couple of them that I'm going to be using for my current OSE game.
Another thing to note with that is that in the real world, frogs don't necessarily just live in ponds.
That's true.
There are some varieties of desert frogs. There's rainforest frogs, and it's quite easy once you've got all the stat blocks there for the Bullywugs to throw out all the information about their society and put them in a different environment to suit your game.
Yeah, I think as well, obviously we're aware that in the real world there's many different varieties of frogs, poisonous ones, like ones that have sort of narcotic properties, brightly coloured ones, dull coloured ones. So if you wanted to have a group of factions of different Bullywugs, you could very easily identify them by like the markings they have on them. Maybe some of them have special abilities, or some of them have got poisonous skin. So I think you were talking about factions earlier. Even if you wanted to do it as like all Bullywugs all the time, then you could still get a lot of variety, and you wouldn't really have to do a lot of other rules, just describe them a bit differently. Maybe chuck in the odd house rule here and there if you want, but you wouldn't have to.
So you've got the red tree frogs who are fighting against the green river frogs, and then the blue frogs from the marsh, they've got like a stake in it as well. And then there's those other frogs from out on the desert that have been travelling through the area. Ooh, what's going on with that? And that's all just frogmen.
Yeah. Then you've got the narcotic ones sitting around in their Hessian shirts, smoking their jungle herbs, and generally not getting involved. But obviously we're joking at the end there, but absolutely, love, I think you're absolutely right. We could we could very easily do like quite a complex, I mean, it doesn't have to be, but it could be quite a complex and detailed sort of interfactional war just with different tribes of Bullywugs, if that's something you wanted to do for your game. So that's our episode on the Bullywug as first featured in the Fiend Folio. We hope you've enjoyed it. If you've got any suggestions for things you'd like to see on episodes in the future, maybe you want to tell us how you've used Bullywugs in your game, if you have.
And keep an eye out for the next Twitter poll for next Monster Friday.
Indeed, we're going to be, at the moment, we're looking at revising our schedule due to many and various things going on. So in the future, we're currently looking at scaling back to doing an episode on Monday and an episode on Friday. Obviously, Friday being the monster episode. And we may drop the occasional call-in episode in between those if we get enough call-ins. So what we're going to do is at the end of each Monday episode, we're going to put a poll up on Twitter asking you which of a selection of monsters you'd like to see cover next. That'll run for 2 or 3 days, and whichever gets the most votes, that'll be the monster we discuss on the following Friday episode. So if you do want to leave us a message, you can drop us a voicemail using the SpeakPipe website. There's a link in the description of this show, or you can send us an email to rddrpgpodcast@gmail.com. Until we see you next time, take care, stay safe, and keep gaming.
Bye. They made a very satisfying thump when they hit the ground.